The call to curb police brutality and end racial injustice has been loud. It's exploded in the streets across America since the death of George Floyd. The question now is how to turn that outcry and emotion into policy and into change. We want to turn now to someone who can hopefully give us some insight into those core issues. And that's our guest right now, Professor Angela Davis of the Washington College of Law and editor of the book, Policing the Black Man. She has taken a special look at and focused in on everything from policing to prosecution. And we hope she can bring us that perspective today. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Margaret.
There is outcry. There are people in the streets, and this has added up to enough political pressure that Washington is responding and saying, we have to do something. And there does seem to be some genuine effort here. Do you believe that this will all add up to becoming a real moment of change?
You know, I'm afraid to be hopeful because we've been here before, right? These killings have been going on, quite frankly, since the time of slavery, you know, through the Black Codes, Emmett Till, Civil Rights Movement, and then, of course, the Trayvon Martin killing, and then Michael Brown's killing. The only thing that is different now is that we have video camera through cell phones and we have social media, but even since that has happened, these killings have continued. So it's really hard to have hope when, you know, the killings keep happening and there's no accountability. However, I do think this moment feels different. I think the protests are extraordinary and unprecedented, where we have people all over the country and people of all races and all backgrounds and people all over the world, quite frankly, really demanding, you know, at this point that there be real meaningful change. And I think, quite frankly, it is sadly because they saw that videotape of George Floyd being murdered before their eyes and a police officer looking into the camera so nonchalantly as if to say, you know, go ahead, film me, nothing's going to happen. And I think they kind of struck a chord with people all over the world. And so I am hopeful that at this moment, there can be some real meaningful change, not just the reforms that people have been promising over the years, but hopefully meaningful change.
What does meaningful change look like to you?
To me, I even hate the word reform. I'm one who's always talking about criminal justice reform, but I don't even like using that word anymore because it doesn't seem meaningful. I think what we really need in terms of meaningful change is an entire reimagination of the police function, an entire dismantling of the current way that policing is done, and a creation of an entirely new model. Because the current model, which is based on control and force and such an easy allowance of the use of deadly force, is one that is destructive and unfair and unjust and racist. You know, Black and brown bodies have been the victims of this. And so to simply say reform, I think is not enough. I think we really need an entire reimagination, rebuilding of what it means to have public safety and how it is done.
We're seeing in some of these protests signs like defund the police or abolish the police. Is that what you mean?
The entire police function in this country has been built on this model of using force unnecessarily. I mean, even if a person's arrested for something as minor as, you know, drunk driving or possession of marijuana or, you know, vagrancy or whatever that is, police officers are trained to grab them, use force, throw them on the ground. You know, look at George Floyd, what he was charged with, right? He hadn't even been charged, but what he's accused of, you know, a counterfeit bill, and yet you put your foot in his neck and murder him. So I'm saying the entire way that policing is done should be changed. And there is a movement out now called Defund the Police, and I actually don't like that title. And I guess the reason I don't like it is I think when people hear defund the police, they immediately think, okay, we're not going to have anybody to call when we're in danger. We can't call 911 because they've gotten rid of the police force. That's not what the defund the police movement is really saying. What that movement wants is for funding, and there is a lot of funding, millions and millions of dollars. The funding that's going into police departments, a lot of it should be diverted to individuals who are trained to deal with many of the issues that police officers are called to deal with, that quite frankly, they're not trained to deal with, namely, homelessness. Like a lot of the issues that bring people to the attention of police officers are public health problems, right? Homelessness, substance abuse, mental health issues. And the police are called and they do what they're trained to do: arrest, use force, etc., when in fact those problems should not be dealt with that way, right? So it's about diverting all this funding to police officers to non-law enforcement individuals, social workers, mental health experts, violence prevention activists, people who know how to train and prevent violence, to divert some of the funding, not all of it, but some of it, to those entities so they can deal with those problems in a non-law enforcement way and allow police officers to concentrate on the serious crime.
I hear activists raise the police unions. Politically, it's not discussed as much on the national scale, with the exception of, I spoke to Senator Tim Scott, obviously Republican from South Carolina, on Sunday, who brought it up saying that it was a poison pill for Democrats, that they wouldn't take on unions. Obviously, he's got a political point of view as well there, but is there truth to that? Is there just too much of a political cost in challenging the unions, therefore people in elected office can't?
Well, it's interesting, Margaret, because police unions are different from all other unions. I think a lot of the unions that protect workers in other fields try to dissociate themselves from police unions. If you look at police unions and the history of police unions, they have a very explicitly racist history. Police unions are of a very different ilk than other unions, and I think that's why I think a lot of people get really confused when they think unions. They think they're all about sort of supporting the workers, but here police unions have been about protecting police officers in a very law and order model that has a racist history, and not just a racist history, but that are currently engaged in racist behaviors in many different jurisdictions. And so I think we have to distinguish police unions from other unions. And I would not say that, Democrats are supporting police unions. That's actually not accurate.
Mm-hmm. Because the other side of that is Democrats in this current conversation in Washington about potential police reform, and the bill that we expect to see come forward in the Senate, is that Republicans have, or at least the president and some Republicans have said they don't want to see any changes to qualified immunity.
Yes.
Is that still part of that same issue you're talking about? It sounds like untouchable. You can't challenge the police.
Right. Well, I guess qualified immunity, which is, of course, the doctrine that basically says that police and other governmental entities are immune from civil suit unless they're violating what's called clearly established law. And it makes it very, very difficult for them to be sued. And just recently, the Supreme Court had the opportunity to take it up again, and they chose not to. So qualified immunity is a problem. And there have been proposals by a number of scholars and others that local entities pass laws that require police officers to behave a certain way, to speak up, to try to stop violence when they see it. And if they don't, they can be sued. And local entities, state governments can pass those laws. But the federal qualified immunity doctrine now is a hindrance. It certainly is a hindrance to there being federal civil rights charges brought against police officers who engage in this kind of misconduct.
We're talking about the police, but you've also, as part of the justice system, focused in on the prosecutor as the most influential figure. And you've called for more transparency in charging and plea bargaining processes. What do you mean by that?
Well, by that I mean, prosecutors are actually, in my view, the most powerful officials in our criminal justice system, bar none. I know, of course, police officers have a tremendous amount of power and discretion on the street. We've seen that, and it's often abused. But police officers, when they're making an arrest, they can bring the person to the courthouse door. That's it. The prosecutor is the person who decides whether that person's going to be charged with a crime and what that charge will be. And that is a tremendous amount of power and discretion. They can decide that they want to charge a person. It's very easy for them to do that. It's more probable than not, probable cause. But even if they have probable cause or even proof beyond a reasonable doubt, they can look at a case and say, you know what, I think I'll give this person a break. I won't charge them, even though I have the power to do so. And so you can see how when they make those decisions, they might give one person a break and not give another person a break. It can create disparities in how they do their job. And oftentimes those disparities break down along race and class lines. And that's the problem. Those decisions are made solely by the prosecutor. They're not accountable to anyone. They make the decisions behind closed doors. It's not like they have to go to court and justify that decision one way or the other. They do not. They make those decisions behind closed doors without any transparency. And all we have to hold them accountable is the ballot box. Because most state and local prosecutors are elected officials. There's about 3,000 county attorneys, district attorneys that call different things in different jurisdictions across the country. And they run for office every 4 years. Most people don't pay attention to those races, but they're extremely important because that's when the people have the power to hold prosecutors accountable. And there recently have been, I think, a movement of new, more progressive prosecutors who are trying to use that power in ways to reduce the incarceration rate and to reduce racial disparities by diverting cases out of the system and not charging petty offenses and so on. Kim Gardner, the prosecutor in St. Louis I just mentioned, is one of them. Kim Fox in Cook County is another, Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, and there are many others. But the vast majority of them, I think it's only about a couple of dozen prosecutors who are now looking at using their power in ways to make the system more fair. The vast majority of them have that old school law and order, charge everybody model, and that's kind of what's gotten us in this predicament today. So I focus on them because they have a lot of power, and they've used that power in ways that have been detrimental, but they can also use that power in ways to make the system better if they just have the will. And that's why it's so important for people to hold them accountable at the ballot box.
All right, Professor Davis, thank you so much for breaking down the issues for us. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.